The request came in on a tertiary relay, which was the first thing that struck me as strange. Not a primary distress channel, not a council aid frequency, not even the standard humanitarian line that every Accord-affiliated station had the access codes for. It came in on a dead channel buffer, the kind of frequency that medical dispatch vessels like ours maintained as a professional courtesy, a whisper line for parties who had been told by every official mouth that no help was coming, and had resorted to throwing words into the dark on the chance that something competent was listening. I was reviewing injury inventory from our last run, a cargo platform accident in the Thresh mid-belt that had left 11 workers with pressure burns and 2 with fractured orbital bones, when Ensign Dakarai flagged it from the comm station. He had a specific way of getting my attention that distinguished between things I needed to see immediately and things I needed to see when I had a moment, and what he used now was the former. He turned in his chair, held the tablet at a particular angle, and said my name and rank without preamble. Dr. Adisa. His expression was the particular one he used when he wasn't sure whether to hand me good news or bad. Tertiary buffer, encrypted, partial translation, the originating party is not using a standard Accord language index. I set down my own tablet, run it through the linguistic relay. Running, a pause while the system worked. Best estimate, a request for medical assistance, pathogen-related, 11 months, they say. The figure 18,000 appears twice. There is a chemical signature attachment. I took the chemical attachment from him personally. I did not ask for the narrative portion, not yet. I sat with the signature data for 6 minutes at my own station while Dakarai waited, politely silent, which was something I had spent considerable effort training him to do in his first 6 months aboard, because most physicians in the field needed to think without being asked what they were thinking. The best corpsmen learn this early and remember it always. Dakarai had been a quick study. The signature was a modified cascade-lytic compound. Not a natural pathogen, not a straightforward mutation, but not quite synthetic either, something that had drifted across the boundary between environmental exposure and pathogenic behavior, the way certain industrial compounds do in closed atmosphere station environments when the filtration runs long past its certified service life. The precursor chemicals were present in the attachment's trace data, a cleaning solvent of the type used in high-cycle fabrication operations, combined with a polymer plasticizer commonly found in pressure seal compounds, metabolized over time by the ambient microbiome of a closed system into something that none of its component chemicals had been individually. I had seen a variant of this signature once, in a training document from the MRD's field toxicology series, and then again in a case file from one of our sister ships that had been decommissioned the year before I came aboard Verity. Both instances had been smaller, a single habitat module, fewer than 300 souls, and both had been caught early. The compound class was not one that killed quickly. That was, in a grim sense, part of its danger. It accumulated slowly, degraded connective tissue over months by disrupting the repair signaling pathways that the body used to direct resources to damaged areas. And by the time a species without human-comparable medical infrastructure had identified what they were dealing with, the window for full recovery had usually been open for several months and was drawing toward its close. The figure 18,000 was a population count. I did the math on the recovery window, using the standard exposure curve for cascade-lytic variants and the 11-month timeline in the request, and found that we were sitting at approximately the 2/3 mark of the intervention window, the outer edge of good outcomes. Still manageable, meaning treatable, recoverable, with appropriate resources deployed without further significant delay. Not comfortable, not a situation where methodical institutional process would serve the population well, but manageable, if someone moved with the kind of decisiveness that large bureaucratic bodies found genuinely difficult. The key question was whether anyone in the Accord's medical response infrastructure had the right specialist knowledge. Cascade-lytic pathology was a narrow field. It intersected industrial chemistry, atmospheric science, and tissue toxicology in ways that general practitioners could not bridge without significant briefing time, and briefing time was what this situation did not have. I wrote one paragraph to my chain of command. I described the pathogen's signature and its classification, the population count and its location in the Thresh outer belt, the estimated exposure timeline, my assessment of the intervention window and what it implied about urgency, and a brief note on the specialist knowledge that effective treatment would require. I attached the full chemical data from the signature file. I noted, in clear language, that the originating party had used a tertiary relay rather than a primary channel, which meant, as anyone who had worked medical dispatch long enough to recognize the pattern would understand, that they had already sought help through the official routes and had not received it, and that the response timeline from any accord body was therefore realistically measured in months rather than weeks, assuming such a response was forthcoming at all. Then I wrote one additional sentence, which I had learned to append to escalations early in my career, which I had never stopped appending because it had never once been wrong when I believed it. I recommend immediate dispatch. I sent it and went back to my injury inventory. The 11 pressure burn cases from the cargo platform accident needed updated wound assessments, and 2 of them were going to require additional debridement at the next dressing change, and there were things I could do in the present moment that were within my power to do. I had learned this, too, the discipline of attending to the work in front of you after you have done everything you can do about the work further away. What I did not expect, what I had learned, intellectually, to expect from Earth's medical logistics system, but had not yet internalized in the embodied way that makes your chest catch when the reality of it lands, was the response that came back to EHS, Verity 7 hours and 14 minutes later. Dakarai brought it to me in the medical bay where I was doing rounds on the pressure burn cases. He stood in the doorway holding his tablet in both hands, which was a posture he had never used with me before, and when I looked at his face, I saw the same expression that I had learned to read on junior staff when something had exceeded the category they had prepared for it. I crossed to him and took the tablet. The authorization from Earth's Medical Relief Directorate read as follows, in the clipped bureaucratic shorthand of an organization that processed a great deal of paper and had learned to be efficient about it. Convoy assembled per escalation protocol. Pathogen classification confirmed cascade-lytic group, modified variant, MRD Tier 2 response threshold met. Assets allocated. EHS Verity lead vessel, EHS Cairnba secondary, EHS Dalloway tertiary, fabrication tender EFS Combe, decontamination engineering barge ETB Marasov, supply ships ECS Falkirk and ECS Andasol, frigate escort EFS Ardath. Specialist, Dr. Priyanka Suresh Good, recalled from retirement, cascade-lytic toxicology, University of Edinburgh Medical Research. Full protocol development authorized in transit. Rendezvous coordinates attached. Departure immediate. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time more slowly, moving through the asset list item by item. 3 hospital ships, a fabrication tender, a decontamination engineering barge, 2 supply vessels, a frigate escort, and a retired toxicologist recalled from civilian life, apparently within the last several hours, who had spent 30 years as the field's foremost researcher in exactly this class of compound, and whose published protocols had become the reference standard used by every Earth medical facility that had encountered cascade-lytic pathology in the past 2 decades. The Velorath, that was the species name the linguistic relay had eventually extracted from the encrypted request, the artisan people of the Amberstar Thresh Belt, had asked for 1 qualified decontamination specialist. They had sent that request through a whisper channel because they had already been refused through every official route. They had made the request as small and as reasonable as they could make it, because they had been trying to be easy to say yes to. We were sending 8 vessels, a fabrication capability, an engineering team, and one of the foremost living experts in the pathogen class that was killing them. I stood with Dakarai in the doorway of the medical bay for a moment. He looked at me. I looked at the authorization. Standard deployment, he said carefully. He was being diplomatic, which was one of his better qualities. Not particularly, I said. Get us underway, and get me a comm line to the Ardeth as soon as we're in formation. I need to speak with Dr. Sureshgood. The transit to the Thresh outer belt took 9 days. I want to describe those 9 days carefully, because the story of what happened at the Veloreth isolation ring is not only the story of 11 days at the station. It is also the story of 9 days of a convoy doing what convoys of this type do when they are given the time and the resources to prepare, which is to say, considerable quiet work that most people never see, and that saves lives more reliably than anything dramatic. The first 2 days I spent reviewing everything available on cascade-lytic compounds, the MRD field series, the published literature I could access through Verity's research database, the case files from the 2 previous incidents I had identified in the signature. The third morning I was in conference with Dr. Sureshgood over the long-range comm, and I want to describe that conversation specifically because it was the moment at which I understood why she had been recalled. She was 71 years old. She had the voice of someone who had been doing the most important work of her life for 4 decades and had not slowed down, precise, unhurried, each sentence carrying exactly the information it needed to carry and no more. She had been briefed on the chemical signature before our first call and had spent the intervening hours building a preliminary model, and within 15 minutes of beginning, she had restructured my understanding of the pathogen's mechanism in a way that changed what we would be doing when we arrived. The compound was not, she explained, degrading the connective tissue directly. It was disrupting the chemical signaling cascade that told the body's repair system where to send resources. The tissue damage was a downstream effect of resources failing to reach the right locations, not direct chemical toxicity to the tissue itself. The distinction mattered enormously for treatment. Most standard cascade-lytic protocols addressed the downstream tissue damage and missed the upstream signaling disruption entirely, which meant they produced symptomatic improvement without halting the actual mechanism. A population treated with standard protocols would appear to be improving while continuing to deteriorate at the root level, and by the time the apparent improvement plateaued and the underlying progression became visible again, several more months of the intervention window would be gone. The treatment protocol needs to address the signaling pathway, she said, which means we need to know exactly how the Veloreth signaling chemistry differs from the human analog, because the pathway we're targeting in humans is not going to be identical. Tissue samples on arrival, I said. Yes, 3 cases from the most acute exposure cohort. I need to see the progression at its most advanced to anchor the model. Everything else I can run in transit, but the samples will tell me whether I need to revise the pathway assumptions. A pause. I've been looking at the fabrication tender allocation. The comb can synthesize the modified treatment compound once I have the formulation finalized. Is their chemistry capacity current? Current and certified, I said. I verified this morning. Good. Another pause. We'll need to move quickly on the synthesis. If the window is as tight as the exposure timeline suggests, I want to be administering treatment to the acute cases within 48 hours of docking. I said, that's aggressive. Yes, she said, it is. The conversation ended because she had other things to do. I found out later, from the Ardeth's communications officer, who had been observing the long-range calls with professional interest, that she had spent approximately 14 of the 24 hours in transit working. That she had been running pathway models on the frigate's processing arrays, which were more powerful than anything on the medical tenders, and which Commander Reith of the Ardeth had placed at her disposal within 30 minutes of her boarding, Because Commander Reith was the kind of officer who understood the difference between the letter of a mission brief and its actual purpose. I also found out later, from the same source, that Dr. Sureshgood had not actually been retired in the full sense of the word. She had retired from her institutional position at Edinburgh 7 years ago, but she had continued writing, consulting, and corresponding with researchers on every continent and several orbital facilities who were working on cascade-lytic problems. The MRD logistics coordinator who had called her had reached her at her home laboratory, where she had been in the middle of reviewing a doctoral student's simulation data. She had told the student she would have comments later and had packed a field kit before the coordinator had finished explaining why he was calling. He had not needed to finish explaining. She had recognized the pathogen classification from the first 2 sentences. The 9 days of transit were the most productive pre-deployment period I have been part of in 22 years of field medicine, and most of what made them productive was happening aboard other ships in the convoy. The decontamination engineering team aboard the ETB Mara, SAV, spent the first 4 days reverse engineering the Veloreth station's atmospheric filtration system, from what the chemical signature implied about their air handling infrastructure. Because the signature's trace compounds contained information about what filtration media the station used, how long it had been running, and at roughly what point in the cycle the precursor compounds had reached the concentration threshold for metabolic conversion. By day 4, they had a working model of the station's ventilation geometry. By day 7, they had a remediation plan that did not require measuring anything on site to execute, only verification. The fabrication team on EFS Combe was running parallel design trees for the modified filtration components before they had confirmed measurements, using the Mara SAV's modeled geometry. 3 trees, 3 design variants, each sized slightly differently to account for the tolerance range in their geometric estimates. On arrival, they would take actual measurements, collapse to the correct tree, and be ready to produce components within hours rather than starting from a blank design. EHS Cairnba and Dalloway and I coordinated the triage rotation from day 4 onward. 18,000 patients, 3 hospital ships, notional baseline of 6,000 per vessel, but that figure was never going to hold in practice because the exposure distribution would not be uniform. Closed atmosphere station environments have microclimatic variation. Sections closer to air handling junctions get higher concentration exposure earlier. Sections near the outer hull with supplementary ventilation get lower. Children, in many species, develop partial resistance to environmental toxins during certain developmental windows due to metabolic differences that adult biology does not retain. Older individuals in species whose detoxification pathways slow with age get hit harder. We built a triage framework that accounted for all of this in the abstract, knowing that the station's own medical records would let us refine it on arrival. The framework was not a plan. Plans pretend to more certainty than the situation permits. It was a set of decision rules. If we see this distribution, apply this rotation. If we see this severity cluster, escalate in this order. The kind of structured flexibility that field medicine requires and bureaucratic medicine finds uncomfortable. On day 6, I asked the supply ships to pull their manifest inventories and walk me through the non-medical cargo. I had noticed, when the allocation came through, that both supply ships were listed at higher than usual tonnage for a convoy of this size, and I wanted to understand what had been allocated beyond the medical supplies and fabrication feedstock. The Falkirk's logistics officer walked me through it over comm. Medical supplies first, pharmaceutical precursors for 6 months of preventive treatment at projected consumption, with a 15% buffer, bandaging and wound care. Equipment for the non-hospital ship treatment stations we would set up in the station's own medical facility. Then the fabrication feedstock for the comb. Then atmospheric media for the remediation. Then food. A significant quantity, not supplement packs or nutritional concentrate, food, the ordinary kind in variety. Protein stores, grain, preserved goods, a substantial quantity of fresh produce that had been loaded in controlled atmosphere at the departure point and would arrive in acceptable condition given the 9-day transit. The fresh produce manifest included approximately 40 varieties. I asked the logistics officer, who had authorized the food allocation. She checked. It came through as a standard extended quarantine supply supplement, she said. Automatically flagged when the mission parameters hit 11 months of isolation. The produce was a specific addition by the MRD Deputy Director, personal authorization. Attached note reads, "They'll need the variety." I did not know the MRD Deputy Director personally. I knew his name from policy documents. The image of a mid-level official in a large bureaucracy taking the time to personally authorize a fresh produce order for an alien population he had never met, on the basis that 11 months of quarantine meant that by now they would need the variety, sat with me for a moment before I let it go and moved on to the next item in the manifest. 9 days. Routine preparation. Nothing to add except that at the end of it we would have an 18,000-person treatment and remediation operation ready to execute within hours of docking. We came around the Amber Primary on day 9, and the Veloreth isolation ring became visible on the forward array. It was a ring-form station, modular, expandable, with living sections arranged along the outer circumference and industrial and processing sections clustered near the hub. Standard thresh belt architecture, the kind that the belt's artisan communities had been building and refining for 3 centuries. From approach distance it looked intact. Clean hull lines, functioning running lights, the Amber Primary's light catching the station's day side in long warm bands across the docking ring, and throwing back a warm amber glow that made the structure look, from a distance, like something that was operating normally. But there were no ships at the docking ring. Not one. 11 months of quarantine markers broadcasting, and not one vessel had docked since the station went under isolation. The approach lanes were empty. The transponder traffic that any functioning port generated as a matter of daily routine, supply runs, personnel transfers, inspection vessels, the ordinary circulatory system of a connected community, was absent. The quarantine markers themselves were still active on the station's hull, which meant that, for 11 months, every vessel that had come within transponder range of this station had received those markers and calculated a course away. I sat with that for a moment. The Veloreth had kept broadcasting the quarantine markers because it was the responsible thing to do, because they did not want to spread what they were carrying, even as they were deteriorating, even as the months accumulated and no help came through any official channel. The quarantine warning that was keeping them isolated was a warning they themselves were maintaining. They had been protecting other species from their own contagion, while that same contagion slowly accumulated in their connective tissue, and their committee appeals went unanswered. "Open a channel to the station," I said to Dakarai. The silence before a response is a specific kind of silence. It carries information. The silence from the Veloreth isolation ring lasted 37 seconds, which I timed because I wanted to know. 37 seconds is longer than it takes a station with functioning communications equipment to open an incoming channel. The length of it told me something about the experience on the other side, about the time it takes to believe that the contact is real, when you have been waiting long enough for belief to have become expensive. Then a voice, not translated yet on first receipt, but even in the original language there was something in the cadence that I recognized, because I had been doing this long enough to recognize it in any language. The sound of someone who had been waiting for a very long time to hear a comm channel open from a direction they had not permitted themselves to expect it from. The translation arrived a beat later through the linguistic relay. This is Orath Vale Station Administrator Velorath Isolation Ring. A pause. We received your transponder codes. Another pause, slightly longer. We sent a request for one specialist. You did, I said. My name is Dr. Yemi Adisa, Chief Medical Officer, EHS Verity. I'm leading the convoy. We're going to need docking clearance for 8 vessels. The pause on the other end of this exchange lasted longer than the previous ones. 8, she said. The word arrived in translation with the intonation of a person who has encountered a figure in a language they know, in a number they understand, but cannot make the two facts cohere into a single parsable statement. 8, I confirmed. 3 hospital tenders, a fabrication vessel, a decontamination engineering barge, 2 supply ships, and a frigate escort. We also have a toxicology specialist inbound aboard the frigate. She'll need a workspace with processing access as soon as we're docked. Can you clear docking rings B and C? There was a silence of approximately 12 seconds. When she responded, her voice had shifted in a way that did not require translation expertise to identify. We can clear rings B, C, and D, she said. We can clear everything. Docking 4 hours is a long time, and I want to account for it, because watching it told me a great deal about the Velorath before I had exchanged a word with anyone on the station other than its administrator. Their docking crews were visibly unwell. The peripheral nerve degradation that was the cascade-lytic compound's early signature manifested in the Velorath, as I would later confirm with the tissue samples, as a tremor in the long fingers, a slight imprecision in movements that 11 months ago would have been practiced and automatic. Docking a vessel is a task that requires fine motor precision, and these crews were performing it with fine motor precision that was measurably degraded. They worked carefully. They communicated with each other in short, precise exchanges, coordinating without wasted words. When a component required more grip strength than the tremor permitted comfortably, 2 crew members shared the task without being asked, one steadying, one operating, with the coordination of people who had been adapting to each other's limitations long enough that the adaptation was unconscious. They did not rush. They did not take shortcuts that the situation might have seemed to argue for. They docked 8 Earth vessels in 4 hours without a single incident, and they did it the right way, which in my experience is always the slower way and almost always the only way that matters. Orath Vale met me at the airlock junction between docking ring B and the station's primary transit corridor. I had seen photographs of Velorath individuals in the xenobiological records that the linguistic relay had surfaced during transit, long-limbed, smooth pale gray skin, the wide amber eyes that gave the species its informal name among belt traders. But photographs do not convey the quality of stillness that characterized her when she was standing still. She was tall, and she stood very straight, and the amber primary's light came through the corridor's exterior viewport and caught the pale gray of her skin and warmed it, and her wide eyes were fixed on me with an expression that I recognized from other contexts and other faces. She was past surprise. She had moved through surprise sometime in the last 4 hours, processing the reality of the convoy while her crews were docking it, and had arrived at the place that exists on the far side of surprise, where a thing has become too large for the category that was supposed to contain it, and your face simply goes still, and you stand upright and breathe carefully and try to recalibrate. Dr. Adisa, she said, we watched your ships come in. I had my staff count them from the observation deck. All 8, I said. All 8. She said it quietly, with the deliberateness of someone repeating a fact they are still working on making real. We sent, she paused, adjusting the sentence. The message we transmitted was specific. One specialist. We were informed by the Accord Medical Council in month 7 that a Tier 1 response required a minimum of 3 months of committee review. We were informed that Tier 2 was not applicable to our situation, because the quarantine had been self-imposed, and therefore the emergency designation was not available to us. We transmitted the message on the tertiary relay because we believed every official route had been exhausted. She stopped. I waited. We were trying to be easy to say yes to, she said. We thought if the request was small enough, that would be harder to refuse. I let that sit for a moment. Dr. Sureshgood is transferring from the RDETH now, I said. She'll need a workspace with processing access, ideally adjacent to your medical facility. She's been developing the treatment protocol for 9 days, and the tissue samples will let her finalize it. I'd like to start triage assessment within the hour, and I'd like to see your patient population records as soon as we can arrange it. Can you take me to your medical facility first? Orath Vale looked at me for a moment. Then she said, as if she could not help herself, "Who is Dr. Sureshgood?" "The foremost living expert in cascade lytic toxicology," I said. "She retired from institutional practice 7 years ago. We recalled her from her home laboratory for this deployment." A beat of silence. "She left her laboratory to come here," Orath Vale said. "She said yes before the caller finished explaining why he was calling," I said, "according to the logistics coordinator who reached her." Orath Vale was quiet. Then she said, "I would like to think about that later. Right now I will take you to our medical facility." She took me. The station's medical facility was on the 3rd ring, in a space that had been designed with the efficient minimalism of a community that had built everything it owned and knew exactly what it needed, and had not built beyond that. 3 treatment wards, a pharmacy, a small imaging suite that used a technology I did not recognize but whose purpose was immediately apparent, and a record system that Cethel Vorn, the medical staffer who introduced herself at the facility entrance, and who I would come to know well over the following days, had maintained with the kind of meticulous completeness that told me immediately what kind of clinician she was. The records were complete. 11 months of exposure data, symptom progression documented case by case, treatments attempted with the facility's own limited resources, and outcomes noted with a precision that would have been impressive in a fully equipped facility, and was remarkable in one operating under isolation with no specialist support. Cethel Vorn had been running the monitoring program largely alone for the past 6 months, after the facility's senior physician had moved into the acute care ward as a patient. I spent 20 minutes with the records before Dr. Sureshgood arrived from the RDETH. When she came through the airlock into the medical facility with a field kit over one shoulder and the focused expression of someone who has been solving a specific problem for 9 days and has arrived at the place where the solution becomes concrete, I watched Cethel Vorn's face. The expression there was not one I can describe easily. It was not relief, though relief was part of it. It was not awe, though that was there too. It was something in the intersection between those things and a third thing, the expression of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just felt the weight shift, and is not yet certain they are allowed to believe the shift is real. Sureshgood crossed to Cethel Vorn directly, ignored me entirely for 30 seconds, and asked her 3 specific questions about the progression curves in the acute cohort. Cethel Vorn answered them precisely with numbers. Sureshgood listened, nodded once, and said, "You've been tracking the right indicators. I need 3 tissue samples from the most advanced cases. Can you take me to them?" "Now," Cethel Vorn said. "Yes," Sureshgood said. They went. I went to the station's records room with Orath Vale and began the triage assessment. The next 11 days had a texture that I can only describe in segments, because no single description does justice to the simultaneity of it. The tissue samples came back confirming Sureshgood's pathway model within 6 hours of docking. The signaling disruption was, as she had predicted, the primary mechanism. The tissue damage was downstream. She had the treatment protocol finalized before the end of our 2nd day aboard, and she communicated it to the medical teams on all 3 hospital ships in a joint briefing that lasted 40 minutes and left no questions unanswered, because She had a gift for anticipating the questions that other clinicians would have and addressing them before they were asked. The fabrication team on the comb had the first batch of modified treatment compounds synthesized by the morning of day 3, using the tissue sample data to anchor the final formulation. I had the acute cohort, 214 individuals, the population from the highest concentration exposure sections, moved to hospitalship wards by the end of day 2, and treatment began on day 3 as planned. The decontamination engineering team from the Mara Sov began the atmospheric remediation on day 2, working in collaboration with the Veloreth's maintenance staff. I want to describe this collaboration specifically, because I watched parts of it from the corridor junction on the station's third ring, and it was one of the things I carried away from the deployment. They worked in pairs, one engineer from Earth, one from the Veloreth station. Not because protocol required it, but because the Veloreth engineers knew the station's geometry, which conduits ran where, which junctions had been jury-rigged during the quarantine period when standard components were unavailable, which sections of the filtration system behaved differently than the documentation described. And the Earth engineers knew the remediation protocol, which media needed to be replaced in which order, which sections needed to be sealed before others were opened, how to sequence the atmospheric cycling to prevent cross-contamination during the remediation process. Neither group's knowledge was complete without the other. The partnership was not a concession to circumstance. It was functionally necessary, and both sides recognized this within the first hour and organized accordingly. I noticed, watching from the corridor, that the Earth engineers had adapted to the Veloreth technicians' tremor within the same period. Not noticeably, not with commentary, but in the practical texture of how they worked. Tools were positioned for easy reach rather than being handed directly, which reduced the precision required in the handoff. Steps that could be done with one person doing the holding and one doing the operating were done that way, with the Earth engineer taking the holding function, without making the division of labor explicit. When a Veloreth technician completed a difficult operation successfully, the Earth engineer would often simply move to the next task without acknowledging the difficulty of the one just finished, because acknowledgement in that context would have meant drawing attention to the impairment, and the impairment was not the point. The task was the point. I had not trained them to do this. They had arrived at it themselves, working alongside people they had known for less than 48 hours, because they were paying attention and they were decent. The remediation took 4 days. The Mara Sov team's post-remediation sweep confirmed clear. The filtration system that went back into operation was not the original. The Combs fabrication team had produced replacement components built to a higher specification than the station's existing units, designed specifically for the Veloreth station's air handling geometry, with a service life rating 3 times that of the components they replaced. When I asked the Combs chief fabricator why the higher specification, she told me that if you were going to rebuild it anyway, it made no sense to rebuild it identically. The mid-exposure population, roughly 6,000 souls, received the preventive protocol in the station's own medical facility, with Earth personnel administering, and Veloreth medical staff trained on the protocol within the first 36 hours. Sethelvorn led the Veloreth side of this training with the focus and precision of someone who intended to do this correctly, and was not going to be satisfied with anything less. She asked questions during the training sessions that demonstrated she had already read everything available about the compound class on the station's limited scientific database, and was working from a genuine understanding of the mechanism, not just rote instruction. Suresh Good noted this to me on day 4 with the specific emphasis of someone who was already thinking about what came next for a particular clinician. The supply ships unloaded on day 2 and day 5. I was present for parts of the second unloading, and I was there when the food cargo came off the Falkirk's lower bay. The Veloreth loading teams paused when the produce containers came out. Not stopped, they kept working, but there was a quality of attention shift in the section of the loading bay where the fresh produce containers were being staged that I noticed from 20 meters away. A loader near the front of the line said something brief to the colleague beside her, and the colleague looked at the containers and said something back, and the exchange was entirely inaudible to me, but its character was completely legible. I found out on day 3 that the station had been rationing food for approximately 4 months. Not catastrophically, because the Veloreth were careful people and had managed their hydroponics carefully, but the variety had narrowed significantly to what the hydroponics could sustain under isolation conditions and what had been left in the preserved goods inventory. The supply allocation from the Falkirk and the Andesol included 6 months' worth of pharmaceutical precursors and medical supplies, fabrication feedstock, and atmospheric media. It also included food in the full variety of the manifest, including approximately 40 varieties of fresh produce, which had been loaded in controlled atmosphere at the departure point on the personal authorization of the MRD Deputy Director, with a note that said they would need the variety. I did not know the MRD Deputy Director. I knew his name from policy documents. I thought about him occasionally over the 11 days, and I thought about the moment when a mid-level official in a large bureaucracy looks at a deployment manifest and adds a fresh produce order because 11 months of quarantine means that by now a population needs the variety, and does so with enough force of conviction to put his own authorization on it. It is a small thing. It is exactly the kind of small thing that does not appear in the mission report. On day 7, Orath Vale asked to speak with me privately. We met in her office on the station's administrative level, a narrow room with a window that looked directly out at the Amber Primary, a view that she had presumably spent considerable time at over 11 months. The Amber Star's light was warm and steady through the glass, the kind of light that does not change with weather because there is no weather in space, only the reliable amber glow of a star going about its business, regardless of what is happening in the structures that orbit it. She sat across from me and was quiet for a moment. I had learned over the 7 days that this was how she began conversations that mattered to her. "I want to tell you about the accord process," she said, "not to complain about it, to make sure you understand the context of what I am about to say." I said, "Go ahead." Month 2, we submitted our initial request through the Accord Medical Council's primary humanitarian channel. We received an acknowledgement of receipt. Month 4, we submitted a formal appeal and provided updated exposure data. Month 5, we received a response indicating that our case had been reviewed and that resources were not available for a Tier 2 deployment at that time. Month 6, we received a letter informing us that our case had been reclassified as a monitoring situation rather than an active intervention case. Month 7, we submitted a second formal appeal. Month 9, we were informed that the situation had been reviewed at committee level and determined not to meet the threshold for emergency intervention, and we were advised to continue quarantine protocols and submit a further review request in 6 months. She was still. The amber light came through the window and warmed the gray of her skin. Month 11, she said. We sent the tertiary relay request. We sent it because we had run our own exposure projections, and we understood that we were approaching the boundary of the intervention window. We sent it through a channel we did not believe was monitored by anyone who could help us. We sent it because we had decided that asking one more time was the last useful thing we could do. She looked at me. You responded in 7 hours. You sent 8 ships. You sent a toxicologist who had retired before this began. You sent food. She paused, and the word food carried the same specific quality it had carried in earlier conversations, not quite breaking, but freighted with something that ran beneath its ordinary surface meaning. "Dr. Adisa, I would like to ask you a direct question." "Ask," I said. "Was this difficult?" I thought about how to answer honestly. "The pathogen signature was recognizable," I said. The population count and the exposure timeline were in the request. The person who processed the tertiary buffer, probably a communications technician whose name I don't know, recognized the signature class and escalated it. The analyst in medical dispatch who received the escalation matched it to the MRD Tier 2 protocol. The deputy director authorized the convoy. Dr. Sureshgood was the right person for the pathogen class, and she said yes immediately. The comb and the Mara Sav were available. The Ardath was available. I paused. Each of those things happened correctly. Because each of them happened correctly, the convoy was assembled. She was quiet. When our protocol says immediate dispatch, I said, it means before the next shift change. The committee review you went through is a different process for different situations. Our escalation protocol exists for situations where the window requires immediate action. 9 months, she said, against 9 days. Different processes, I said, different thresholds for what triggers each one. She looked out the window at the amber primary for a long moment. When she turned back, her expression had resolved into something I had not seen clearly on her face before, though its components had been present since the airlock on day 1. It was the expression of a person who has spent 11 months building an understanding of what is possible, and has now been presented with evidence that the understanding was wrong, and is deciding what to do with the revision. You are telling me, she said slowly, that this was your system operating normally. Within the bounds of what the situation called for, I said, yes. The 8 ships, she said, the retired specialist, the food. All of those were within the parameters of what the situation called for, I said. Dr. Sureshgood was not required to be recalled. We have other cascade-lytic specialists. She was the best available, and the logistics coordinator believed the situation warranted the best available, so he called her. And she came, Orathvale said. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment. I am going to think about this for a very long time, she said finally. We departed on day 12. The 214 most acute patients were responding to treatment and would remain aboard EHS Cairnba for the transit to the nearest full care facility at Thresh Outer Station Meridian, where they would complete their recovery under Dr. Sureshgood's protocol, which had already been transmitted to the receiving facility's medical team in full. Sureshgood had arranged the transfer of care personally, speaking with the Meridian facility's chief of toxicology over comm on day 10 and walking them through the protocol in detail. The facility's chief had told her it was the most complete handover document she had received in 15 years of practice. Sureshgood had said that she hoped not to need to send it again, and the conversation had ended there. The station's atmospheric remediation was complete and verified clear. The filtration system was rebuilt. The preventive treatment supply was in the station's medical stores, with the monitoring protocol and trigger thresholds documented in plain language in the Veloreth's written form. Sureshgood had written the 7-page summary document on her own time, outside the mission scope, and had asked Cethel Vorn to review the translation for accuracy. Cethel Vorn had reviewed it on day 10 and told me on departure morning that it was accurate. She had been holding a printed copy when she told me, which she had printed herself, which I understood. She wrote this so we would know what we were looking for, Cethel Vorn said, after you left. Yes, I said. She did not have to write this. No, I said. She didn't. She wrote it because she thought you should be able to take care of yourselves once we were gone. That's what she told me when I asked her about it. Cethel Vorn looked at the document. I looked at her face, and I thought about what it cost to hold that information in a context like hers. 11 months of isolation, one medical staffer effectively running a facility's monitoring program alone, a committee process that had told them for 9 months that help was not coming, and what it did to a person to receive, from a stranger who was already leaving, the explicit message that they had been worth taking the extra time for. I did not say anything else. Some things do not benefit from being added to. Departure was at 8:03. All 8 vessels cleared the docking ring without incident, formed convoy standard on the Ardath's heading, and began the transit to Thresh mid-belt. I filed my mission report that afternoon. 7 pages, standard format, standard categories, patient population and treatment protocol summary, environmental remediation status and certification, supply disposition, departure status, follow-up recommendations, and outstanding care requirements. I filed it as a routine closeout document, because within the Medical Relief Directorate's operational parameters it was a routine closeout document. A convoy deployed, a cascade-lytic outbreak treated, a station remediated, a population stabilized, a protocol documented. In the follow-up recommendations section, I noted that the Velorath isolation ring's communications infrastructure should be upgraded to include a primary emergency line, so that any future request would not need to route through a tertiary relay and hope for the right listener. I noted that the discrepancy between the Accord Medical Council's 9-month review timeline and the MRD's 9-day response timeline for the same situation appeared to merit examination at an appropriate level. I noted that Dr. Suresh Good and the ETB Mara Sov decontamination engineering team should be formally commended, and I worded the commendation recommendations carefully, because they had both done work that exceeded their stated mission scope, and that deserved to be in the permanent record. In the freeform notes field at the bottom, a field I typically left blank, I wrote one sentence. It was not required. It was not for any particular reader. I wrote it because Orath Vale had asked me to hold something in my mind, and I had held it for 7 days, and it needed somewhere to go. The sentence read, "The station's quarantine markers were still broadcasting when the convoy arrived. They had never ceased warning other vessels away, through all 11 months, because the Velorath had decided this was the responsible thing to do even as it guaranteed their isolation." I closed the report and filed it. In a drawer in my office on EHS Verity, there is a printed page. It is the cover sheet of Dr. Suresh Good's summary document. 7 pages of plain language in the Velorath written form, translated and verified, describing the pathogen mechanism, the treatment rationale, and the indicators that would tell Cethel Vorn and her colleagues whether something was recurring that they needed to escalate. Cethel Vorn had given me a copy on departure morning, and I had taken it because refusing it would have been the wrong thing to do. I cannot read the Velorath written form. The page tells me nothing when I look at it. I keep it because it is a document written by a 71-year-old toxicologist who came out of her laboratory without waiting for the question to be finished, who traveled 9 days to the Thresh outer belt, who wrote a treatment protocol from transit data and tissue samples, and the meticulous records of one young clinician who had been doing a tremendous job entirely alone, and who then spent additional time she was not required to spend, time that was not in any mission parameter. Writing 7 pages of plain language in someone else's written form so that, when we were gone, they could manage their own ongoing care. That is the kind of thing that should be kept somewhere. Orath Vale's last words to me at the airlock on Docking Ring B, where she had met me on arrival and where she met me again for departure, a deliberate choice, I was sure of it, were these: "Dr. Adisa, we will tell our children that we sent a very small message into a channel we did not believe was being heard, and that the people who answered sent 8 ships and a retired expert and fruit, and left us able to take care of ourselves. They will know that this is what humans do." I said, "We just sent what you needed." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Precisely. I know that is how you understand it. I am asking you to hold for a moment that this is not how we will understand it." I held it, I still hold it. The amber primary was at our backs when the convoy cleared the docking ring. I watched the station on the aft array, clean hull, rebuilt filtration, quarantine markers still broadcasting their responsible warning into the empty approach lanes, until the display angle shifted and the station was gone, and there was only the amber light and the formation of 8 ships and the long routine transit ahead. Nothing to add. Let me tell you about the patient wards, because I said I would skip the medical details, and I find that I cannot leave them out entirely. EHS Verity's wards were configured for 210 patients at standard capacity. The acute cohort from the Veloreth isolation ring numbered 214. We had 4 additional in the corridor berths that we used for overflow on busy runs, and by day 2 all 4 were occupied, and by day 3 every bed on all 3 hospital ships was in use. The Veloreth who came aboard Verity were, in most cases, quiet patients. I had worked with perhaps a dozen species in my career, and I had learned that the experience of illness manifests differently across physiologies and across cultures, and that you cannot assume anything about how a being in distress will present. What looks like stoicism might be pain behavior. What looks like agitation might be the species equivalent of calm communication. The Veloreth in our wards were quiet in a way that I eventually understood as a specific cultural practice. They did not make their pain audible unless they were alone, and perhaps not even then. What they did do was observe. They watched the nursing staff move between beds. They watched the monitors above their own berths with a focused attention that told me they were reading the data, or trying to, and that many of them found the attempt useful even without understanding the instrument scales. When a staff member did something they had not seen before, they tracked it carefully. When Corpsman Fadua, who had a gift for making patients feel attended to without being attended upon, explained what he was doing before he did it, the Veloreth in his rotation listened with the specific quality of attention of people who prefer to understand the process they are participating in. On day 5, one of the patients in Ward 3, a male with a craftworker's hands, the calluses of long hours at close work, and the slower recovery trajectory of someone who had been in a high-concentration section for most of the 11 months, asked Corpsman Fadua, through the translation relay that we had established in each ward, whether he could see the monitoring data in a format he could read. Fadua came to me with the question. I considered it for approximately 30 seconds and then told him to have the data relay team adapt the display format. It took the relay team 40 minutes. The result was a parallel readout alongside the standard monitor that expressed the key indicators in a visual format that any numerically literate person could interpret without knowing Earth's medical notation conventions. By the end of that day, 4 other patients in Ward 3 had asked for the same adaptation. By the end of day 6, we had rolled it out to all 3 hospital ships' wards because it was clearly what the patients wanted, and it was a better design than what we had been using. The craftworker, his name, through the translation relay, was rendered approximately as Soren Vale, which I learned was a common suffix construction indicating artisan caste membership. Thanked Fadua for the adaptation in a brief exchange on day 8. Fadua reported the exchange to me not because it was medically relevant, but because Soren Vale had, through the translator, asked him a question. Had anyone on Earth designed the adaptation, or had Fadua done it himself? Fadua had told him that he had asked for it to be done because a patient wanted it. Soren Vale had said, through the translator, that in his understanding, the relay operator was a corpsman and not a physician, and that he had expected physicians to make decisions of this type. Fadua had said that decisions about what information a patient could see were generally made by whoever was paying attention. Soren Vale had apparently sat with this for a moment and then said, "That seems correct. I had not thought about it that way, but that seems correct." Fadua was pleased by this in the quiet way that good corpsmen are pleased by things, not demonstratively, but lastingly. I have been filing mission reports for 22 years. I have never found a way to put Soren Vale's question into the standard format. I note it here instead, in the space between the report and the thing the report does not quite contain, where all the things I actually remember seem to accumulate. On day 9, 2 days before departure, Dr. Sureshgood asked me to walk with her through the acute care ward on EHS Dalloway, where she had been spending most of her clinical time. She was not a person who asked for company without reason, and she did not explain why she was asking, so I went. We walked the ward for 40 minutes. She stopped at several beds, not all of them, the ones she had been following most closely, and reviewed the progression data, asked the patient or the attending nurse brief questions, and made small notes in the field record she carried clipped to her forearm. At the last bed she stopped at, she stood looking at the monitoring readout for a longer time than the others. The patient there was an older woman, one of the most severely exposed cases. She had been the senior filtration technician in the high-concentration processing section, which meant she had been spending 6 to 8 hours a day in the worst area of the station for most of the 11 months. She was past the acute danger, but her recovery arc was going to be the longest of the cohort, and what she recovered to might not be what she had been. Sureshgood looked at the monitoring readout. She looked at the patient. The patient was asleep. Then Sureshgood said, to me and not to anyone else, if we had been here 6 months ago, this one would recover completely. I did not say anything. 7 months ago would have been better, she said. 8 months ago, I wouldn't be worrying about the recovery ceiling at all. She made a note. But 6 would have been sufficient. She clicked the note closed, and we walked out of the ward. In the corridor, she said, the protocol will hold. Her long-term prognosis is reasonable. But I want that 6 months on the record somewhere, so that the next time this compound class appears in a closed atmosphere environment and someone puts together a committee review instead of an escalation call, there is a documented case of what the committee review cost. I said, I can put it in my mission report. Yes, she said, put it in your mission report. I put it in my mission report. It is in the clinical outcomes section, expressed in the appropriate technical language, with the patient identified only by case number, and the 6-month figure embedded in the recovery trajectory analysis where it belongs and where anyone reading carefully will see it. On day 10, the morning before we began departure preparations, Sethelvorn came to find me in the station's medical facility where I was doing a final review of the monitoring protocol documentation. She stood in the doorway in the particular way of someone who has decided to say something and is making sure she has the right words before she begins. Dr. Sureshgood has agreed to receive correspondence, she said, from our medical staff, if we have questions about the protocol or if we observe something in a patient's progression that we want a second opinion on. I said, that sounds like her. She said to use the standard medical correspondence relay and to mark it urgent if the situation required it. Sethelvorn paused. She said she checks the relay every morning. I thought about a retired toxicologist who had come to the Thresh outer belt for 11 days and would now be checking her correspondence relay every morning for case queries from an artisan caste species whose medical staff she had met less than 2 weeks ago. She checks it every morning, I said. Yes, Sethelvorn said. She told me this 3 times. I believe she wanted to make sure I understood that she meant it. She did, I said. She means everything she says 3 times. Sethelvorn looked at me with an expression that had become familiar over the 11 days. Not quite a smile, because the Veloreth facial musculature did not produce the expression that reads as a smile in human terms, but a softening around the wide amber eyes that I had come to understand as its functional equivalent. I will write to her, she said. Good, I said. And that, too, is not in the mission report. The mission report ends at departure. What happens after departure, the correspondence relay checked every morning, the questions sent and answered across the transit distance between the Thresh outer belt and wherever a retired toxicologist does her mornings. That is a different document, being written day by day in a medium that has no file number and will not be submitted to anyone. Some things are like that.